The subject of this DVD is pawn structures. A lot of club players are struggling with understanding the features about pawn structures. So in this first introduction, I would like to present some definitions about pawn structures. And in the diagram, we see different types of pawn structures. For instance, we have the double pawn on B2 and B3, which we call an isolated double pawn. As you can see easily, those pawns are quite weak and can be very vulnerable for the opponent's pieces. Another double pawn is F6 and F7 for black, but because of the presence of this pawn on E6, we can say that this kind of double pawn is not necessarily weak. In several cases, black can advance his pawn to E5, and if white is ready to take it and black takes back, then black is got rid of his double pawn. Another kind of pawn we see here is the isolated pawn. That is the pawn on D4. This pawn is not connected by any of his brothers and sisters, so it's completely isolated and has to be protected by own pieces. Normally such a pawn can become very weak, but there are several middle games where such a pawn is used as an attacking weapon. We will see that in another chapter in this video. The pawn on G4 is on a half open file of black, so if black uses a rook on G8 attacking this pawn, we call this pawn a backward pawn. The pawn has not a connection with some other white pawn which can defend him. And very important is that the square in front of this pawn is protected by one own pawn, like in this one, the F6 pawn. So a backward pawn is defined as a kind of weakness because of the square on G5 in this case can be used for a black piece. The pawn on H5 is a pass pawn. A pass pawn will say that this pawn is going to promote without meeting some opponent's pawns, and that this pawn can go to the back rank. Because this pawn now in this position is protected by the pawn on G4, we call this a connected pass pawn. But if white plays H6, it's not connected anymore, but it's only a pass pawn.